Все.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us today. My name is Olha Atamanova, and I'm happy to see all of you here in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. It's been 10 years of the war, and today is day 427 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And now we will be talking about the torture used by the Russians against our citizens, the torture which became one of the instruments of the war in Russians. According to the latest data of the Office of the Prosecutor General, we know that there were more than 70,000 war crimes committed against Ukrainians. So how does the Russia use the torture, and why do the Russians use the torture as one of the tools, and how to bring them to liability for those crimes? This is what we will be talking about during our meeting today. I want to introduce our speakers. It's Oleg Natyuk, project manager at the ZMINA Human Rights Center, Boris Petronyuk, researcher at the ZMINA Human Rights Center, Anatoly Haragati, a resident of the Kharkiv region who unfortunately became a victim of torture. And joining us online will be Sergei Pogorelov, Kyiv region resident. He is about to join us. I hope he will make it. And Maria Kwitsinska, World Organization Against Torture and Right by my side is Denis Lysenko, Prosecutor General's office. Good morning, dear friends. Let's start this conversation with you, Mr. Oleg. So why do Russians so massively use such tool, such weapon as torture? Why is it happening, and why do they torture Ukrainians? Good morning, dear colleagues. My name is Oleg Natyuk. I'm the project manager at the ZMINA Human Rights Center, and our organization is a part of the coalition 5 AM Ukraine, who coordinates their efforts for systemic research of the war crimes, their documenting and further advocacy and other relevant steps and measures. So today I will give you some figures which summarize our research. I will tell you a little bit about it. So our research was called Torturing and Ill Treatment of Ukrainians in the territories which were under Russian occupation, in the instances of Kharkiv, Kyiv, and other regions. You will be able to get yourself familiarized with this research after our meeting. We want to thank Maria Kwitsinska, the World Organization Against Torture, for support in preparation of this research. This research was prepared with the support of the Prague Center for Human Rights. And what was the purpose? What were the questions we wanted to answer during our research? So based on the evidences collected, we were trying to explain the nature of such crime as torture in the territories occupied by Russia, how those crimes were going on, how to explain such massive number of strikes, how torture and encouragement of this practice by the Russian military command correlates with the general situation in occupied territories, and the policy which is being implemented by Russian Federation over there. And obviously the global goal was to reinstate justice for those who became the victims of tortures in the territories which were under temporary occupation by Russia. So you already mentioned the scale of the war crimes which are being committed, and the statistics are growing in the website of the Prosecutor General. Now it's been more than 80,000 crimes documented, and we have information from the National Police of Ukraine as of 19 April 2023 reports about 52 torture chambers all across Ukraine. First is Kharkiv region, then goes Kherson, Kyiv, Donetsk, Chernihiv regions, and so on. So the scale of the crimes by Russian Federation requires the growth of capabilities to collect evidences and document crimes to bring Russian Federation to liability for crimes against humanity. So within this research we started documenting the torture since the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, and we ended our research in March 2023. We questioned 45 persons from Kyiv, Kharkiv and Kherson regions. 28 of them were the victims of tortures and 17 others were the witnesses. Among the witnesses were the doctors, the representatives of local governments, and the members of the families of the victims of tortures. In February, we documented the information from the open sources, and as of today, 300 such reports, according to the Berkeley Protocol, were documented from open sources. In general, to summarize our work, there were 345 documented cases within this period. 345 cases of tortures, and all those cases were handed to the coalition database of the war crimes called IDOC. National law enforcement agencies and international organizations have access to that database. It accumulates all the crimes, including crimes against humanity, which are being committed, and it may facilitate the work of investigators and other human rights organizations to identify and monitor such crimes and implement relevant mechanisms for their investigation. In terms of national and international advocacy, our purpose is not only to document the crimes and to make a report for the sake of report. We want those crimes to be investigated and all those guilty to be brought to liability eventually. So we handed 30 documented cases of tortures to the Department of Counteraction of crimes committed within the period of the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the prosecutor's office confirmed that they are processing this information. I want to thank Mr. Denis as a representative of Prosecutor General's office for joining us today. We will hear about the activities of the prosecutor's office in investigation of torture cases and other information which may become public. We also prepared a joint report with the World Organization Against Torture and Media Initiative for Human Rights, which is called Systemic Torture of the Civil Population in the Territories under control of Russian Federation, and we sent it to the Special Commissioner of the United Nations for Tortures. There was also another joint report jointly developed by those three organizations, was sent to International United Nations Committee for Violation of Human Rights in Ukraine, and it was sent to monitoring mechanism of the United Nations Council for Human Rights. There were 4 individual applications from the victims of torture which are being prepared, and they will be soon sent to the Special Commissioner of the United Nations for Tortures. 3 individual applications from the victims of tortures are being prepared and will be sent over to the International Criminal Court shortly too. This is only the beginning that our organization, the beginning of the activities our organization started doing. We will continue our work on systemic documenting of tortures, and we will prepare new applications to international mechanisms, international investigation bodies. And to summarize my address, I want to say that it's important to coordinate the efforts between the human rights organizations, national law enforcement agencies, international law enforcement mechanisms, to make sure that the cases of tortures are being properly documented and investigated. And we need to have effective approach to documenting of war crimes, so there should be methods developed in compliance with international standards to make sure the international mechanism react properly to the cases of torture and investigate them in a proper manner. We were acting in compliance with the Istanbul Protocol, questioning the victims of tortures, and we were assisted and consulted by the International World Organization Against Torture. And we will continue documenting war crimes in Ukraine. Thank you. I'm done with my address. Thank you. Ms. Boris, let's talk in detail. What were you able to investigate? Who are the first that Russia starts to persecute and torture? What methods do they use to break our citizens, break our Ukrainians? Good morning, my name is Boris Petrunyok. I'm the researcher at the ZMINA Human Rights Center. I would like to describe the results of our research in brief, what we've seen in the occupied territories. So first, what is worth to focus attention on is that Russian Federation, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they deployed the network of terror against civil population. So they're basically in war with the civilians. So since the middle of March, when Russians realized the level of resistance of civil population on all levels, either active or passive resistance, which all the population was ready to get engaged in, they reacted to that in their specific way. Unfortunately, in Kyiv region, where we were researching the tortures committed in March last year on the first scale, unfortunately, we were facing a lot of cases when people were tortured to death. So they were tortured and then killed. So, and the Russian troops which were staying there, they didn't have any understanding or patterns how to act with the civil population. When they were capturing civilians as hostages, they not always were understanding how to handle them, and which increased the risks of murder. They perceived the civil population as a threat because they could hand over the information to the military, and this is why we've seen all those horrors in Bucha, Hostomel and other places in Kyiv region. But then we've seen that in April-May 2022, Russian Federation started changing their approach, if we can say so, their approach to handling civil population. They started implementing screening measures. They were picking certain categories of citizens whom were considered the most dangerous, not loyal, and they were approaching those people in a very special way. So they were mostly retired military, the veterans of anti-terroristic operation, participants of Euromaidan, civil volunteers, just people who were bringing meals to the denizens of the same villages or towns, the representatives of local governments, the representatives of national police, or just informal leaders who had some authority and enjoyed some respect in their communities. They were all tortured, interrogated by Russians, and sometimes killed, murdered then. So in that case, interrogation without torture became an anomaly. When we talk about Kharkiv region or Kherson region, any detention is related to potential tortures during interrogation. Those and almost all of the Russian military units were involved in those tortures. Police functions were exercised by FSB of Russian Federation, and at the same time those crimes were also involved in military units of so-called LPR and DPR, and our citizens witness about the cruelty from representatives of national minorities, such as from Caucasus, Chechens, Dagestanis, and so on. And the level of cruelty may vary from one settlement to another. But again, what's the most horrible is that it's a planned policy of terror, and main parameters of how to deal with the civil population, how they are being detained, how they are being tortured, resembles like the same pattern everywhere. It's the coordinated policy, coordinated by the top level military command and government officials. So this is where we can talk about systemic nature. Sometimes the victims of the tortures were told that all of the population will go through the so-called cellar, through the basement. So they were trying to check in this way everybody, all the denizens of this or that settlement. So what I would like to say, to summarize why it is important to continue our work, like Oleg mentioned, in a view of all of this massive number of war crimes, the capacities are not enough. The coalition 5 AM Ukraine and the Prosecutor General's office, they do a great job, but their capacities are still not, their capabilities are not enough. We have to reinstate the rights of the victims, we have to seek justice, and we have to understand that the armed forces of Ukraine, they don't just liberate territory, they liberate people who right at this moment may be imprisoned, they may be sitting in basements, they may be tortured at this very moment, and every day that the territory is under occupation, those people are the hostages. This is why we have to seek maximum support from the Western community, from all of our partners, and to assist reinstating justice and bringing to liability all of the Russians who were involved in committing those war crimes. Thank you, Mr. Boris. Then, Mr. Anatoly, you met the occupiers in Kharkiv region. What was your experience? My name is Anatoly Garagaty. I live in Srinsy settlement in Kharkiv region. I've just turned 70 years, and more than 50 years I'm fond of photo and video shooting. I made a lot of documentaries about my native place, and I opened my YouTube channel called Anatoly Garagaty YouTube video, and when Russian troops entered our settlement, I was shooting the footage of the convoy from the third floor of the building, and I had active patriotic stance, and I uploaded all those videos to YouTube. Immediately I've uploaded the videos of our guys stopping the Russian convoy without letting them enter the village, and I had to pay for that. On the 28th of May I was arrested back then, and I was sent to Balaklia confinement cell, where I spent 100 days sharp. One of the most evil Bandera activists, Banderovets, like a person of 70 years. What can I say? I suffered some tortures, just like the boys said. There is nothing else to add. I don't have to prove anything, I've seen it all. Thank you very much, Mr. Anatoly. I would like to have Miss Maria Kvitsinska join our conversation. Miss Maria, are you with us? Thank you for your invitation. Miss Maria, before we proceed to the work of the Office of Prosecutor General, I would like to talk with you about the responsibility and liability. What should we do as a state, as Ukraine, and what should the human rights organizations do to make sure that all those who committed war crimes are brought to liability? When the full-scale invasion was beginning, us as an international human rights organization, we were hearing that there is a lack of the instruments to bring the guilty ones to liability, and that the problem exists. But we have to understand that if there will be the international tribunal created tomorrow, what should we come there with? And there was a lack of proper documenting of tortures, because we have to understand that whether International Criminal Court or the United Nations bodies who identify the violation of human rights, they require the properly documented cases, the questioning of victims, some representative demonstrative information, and medical documents to support them. In Ukraine, there is a huge problem with medical expertise according to the Istanbul Protocol, because for the time being such examination can be done only within the criminal investigation if it was appointed by the prosecutor's office. And since the number of crimes is so massive, the prosecutor's office not always makes it providing necessary documents to initiate such medical examination. And that is a problem, because we have a number of strategic cases that we are about to submit to the international bodies, and on part of Ukraine not all of the necessary steps are made, so we could submit to the international mechanism and require to bring Russia to liability. Yes, we address many international platforms, we address OSCE, European Union, and so on, but I would like to proceed to the recommendations to Ukraine, because there are very practical things that Ukraine can do now. First is medical examinations. There is a very successful experience in Kazakhstan, where in regular clinics the people were examined. So the doctors, they had a simplified form which takes up to 30 minutes to fill. People may tell the information about their torture, and then after filling that form, which can be signed by a doctor, they can submit to either national law enforcement agencies or international ones. Another step that can be made by Ukraine is the ratification of the Rome Statute, and the third one is the programs for psychosocial and medical rehabilitation for the victims of tortures, because we're unfortunately facing this situation where the majority of the victims, they don't have enough funds for basic medical treatment, and there are a lot of victims of tortures, and human rights organizations just won't be able to cover all of them. It should be done by the state probably. There is a lot of European countries, the international donors, who can invest a lot of funds in their rehabilitation programs if Ukraine comes up with this issue. Thank you, Miss Maria. Mr. Denis, I would like to ask you, what is the state of affairs with the documenting of the war crimes like tortures, and based on what Ms. Maria said and other human rights activists say, that given this such massive number of war crimes which are documented for the time being, no one will do a homework for us. We are all interested, and we can say that there is a social demand to have all those who committed those crimes to be brought to liability. So how do you see that process? Thank you for invitation. It's an honor to be in the presentation of this summary of this research. I've got myself familiarized with it previously. I want to say that the results of work of the investigators and prosecutors, they are in compliance with the basic summaries of this report. We face it in a daily manner. The scale is much bigger, but the main patterns are the same everywhere, and I appreciate the input of ZMINA group who assists us in doing our job. So it's been more than 9 years of the armed conflict in Ukraine, and all those 9 years the law enforcement agencies document multiple war crimes committed by the representatives of aggressor state. However, there was a significant leap in scale of cruelty since which happened from the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when all of the regions of Ukraine felt those cruel actions on them, and 12 regions were temporarily or occupied in full or in part. So now there is the pre-court investigation on the way of more than 70,000 war crimes, and about 5,000 of them are related to the ill treatment of the civil population. What is ill treatment? It's a little bit different from the norms of international law. So we include inhuman behavior, inflicting damage to health, or torture. So those are the cases that the civil population of almost all of the regions which suffered temporary occupation, what they faced with. And the cruelty of the occupiers is not only spread into the civilians, but also to the military prisoners of war. For the time being, the law enforcement agencies exercise pre-court investigations of 265 cases of the cruel behavior with the prisoners of war, and more than 1,500 Ukrainian prisoners of war are recognized as the victims of that type of crime. As to the results of this research, we see that there are certain trends and tendencies and patterns in the behavior of the occupiers. This cruelty has a systemic nature. It's natural for all of the regions, all of the armed units of the Russian Federation. They all violate the international humanitarian law, which prohibits cruel behavior with the cruel treatment of the prisoners and tortures. And as it was said, there is certain correlation with time of occupation and intensity of battles in the territories of this or that region. And also what I wanted to emphasize is that the real number of victims of the torture, it's difficult to imagine, because we identified thousands of such persons. But in this context, we have to keep in mind that for the time being, we are still investigating about 15,000 cases of illegal imprisonment and 2,000 murders. So we understand that all those crimes are interrelated, and those persons who are illegally imprisoned, they then sometimes, or in the majority of cases, they become tortured, just like those who are murdered are being tortured previously before they are murdered. and there were splashes, so to say, of new cases documented which happen after the territories are being liberated. So we discover some horrible details of the enemy operations. We find the places of mass detention of Ukrainian citizens and so-called torture chambers. We differ those places in our practice because sometimes people are being detained in improper conditions, like a big number of people. For example, a school in the village of Yahidne, where there were 400 persons detained in a small area, but in a small premise, but it was not a torture chambers because they were used as the live shield. But there are places where people are being kept detained in multiple numbers. They are traditionally some captured police departments where people are being interrogated and tortures are being applied to them along with other forms of cruel treatment. So both of those cases are absolute evil, but we differ them in our practice. So for your information, if we stop at those three regions that were reflected in the research, in your research, for example, in Kyiv region, for the time being, the law enforcement agencies identified 8 torture chambers, systemic chambers, through which dozens of people were filtered, and about 30 of them were murdered further on. In Kharkiv region, there is in the occupied part of the Kharkiv region, there was the confirmed existence of 21 torture chambers. 112 people were questioned out of those who went through those torture chambers. But we have to keep in mind that torturing is chaotic and spontaneous. Not everybody goes through torture chambers. I'm talking about the places of mass detention and cruel treatment. As to the Kherson region, for the time being, we have confirmed information about 18 torture chambers, and the law enforcement agencies identified 600 victims who were kept in those places, and part of them were recognized as victims under investigation procedure. As to the overall situation in Ukraine, the investigators are investigating the cases of operation of 55 places of illegal detention and so-called torture chambers which were identified in the occupied territories. About 60 such places are now in occupied territories, and the circumstances of their operations are being currently investigated, but there are certain specifics to this investigation. In this context, we should not forget that, for example, law enforcement agencies of Ukraine are being document the facts of operation of such sites since the beginning of the war, since 2014. So before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we identified about 100 such places in Donetsk and Luhansk region, through which within the period from 2014 to 2022, more than 3,000 Ukrainian citizens were filtered, both civilians and military prisoners of war, and in all those places tortures and other forms of cruel treatment were applied to them. I will stop shortly at the investigation of this type of war crimes. So talking about Kyiv region, upon our investigation of cases of cruel treatment, the notes of suspicion were served to more than 40 persons. More than 30 cases are already in the courts, and 5 persons are already convicted in their absence, according to special procedure. In Kharkiv region, 12 people are being brought to criminal liability, and 5 of them were convicted. In Kherson region, the note of suspicion was served to 20 persons. 17 of them are being considered by the courts at this moment. Overall in Ukraine, 120 persons were served note of suspicion, and 19 of them are already convicted. Another number worth mentioning, or I would rather say the results of investigation of such war crime as intentional murder. Intentional murder is the continuation of the cruel treatment, and to demonstrate the picture we have to investigate those numbers. So 40 persons are served notice of suspicion for cruel treatment with Ukrainian citizens. 19 cases are being forwarded to the court, and 2 persons are already convicted of intentional murder. What is reflected in this analytical summary and what we state is that the systemic nature of persecution of Ukrainian citizens by the occupiers, well, it's a pattern. There is a screening system in place. Different types of cruel treatment are being applied, along with the murders of Ukrainian citizens who fail to undergo that screening, or that they raise some suspicions with the occupiers. So all those facts makes us look at this unprecedented cruelty in a more systemic way, in a global way, and we are trying to prove all of those facts through the existence of relevant policy with the aggressor state. And this policy is oriented at total terror of civil population in occupied territories or genocide of Ukrainian nation. We keep working in this area. We can continue to identify the concept of the government of Russian Federation and to give it a legal assessment. So our priority for the time being is that most likely is the genocide of Ukrainian nations going on. We have all reasons to assume so, and we have certain evidences, and we hope that we will prove that fact on both national and international level. Regarding fighting with torture and cruel treatment with Ukrainians, this type of crime is being paid a lot of attention by the law enforcement agencies and a lot of efforts by both Office of Prosecutors General and other law enforcement agencies. The office tries to coordinate all those efforts and to render them more efficient. By this week it was approved, and shortly it will be disseminated among the investigators the standards for investigation according to the Article 438, illegal detention and cruel treatment. That's a fundamental work which involved the effort of both Ukrainian and international specialists. So this experience will be shared with all the investigators and prosecutors who face investigation of this type of crime. Again, I want to emphasize the necessity of such research. We want every fact, every evidence reflected in such report by any such organization like your human rights organization or international organization. They should be all verified and then investigated by both Ukrainian and international law enforcement agencies. For example, as to the Kharkiv region, according to my information, the witnesses in Kharkiv region are not yet questioned by the law enforcement. I don't have a response so far. In Kherson region, by the facts that were described in your research, there will be a notice of suspicion served to one person in Kherson region. Thank you, Mr. Denis. Our time is running out, so I want to let our colleagues ask the question.
Or worse, aside from the fact that you had some areas that were under occupation for longer period of time, were there areas that were worse for torture, or was it pretty consistent across all of the occupied territories?
Якщо це питання до мене, то я відповім. Як я вже казав, тут є
As I already mentioned, there is a strict correlation between the territories which were under occupation, time of that occupation, and intensity of battles in that territory. For example, if the occupiers were more engaged in armed counteraction with the armed forces of Ukraine, they had less time to terrorize local population. If they were occupying the territory for a long time and it ended up for a long time under this occupation, and there was the occupational administration established there, so obviously the number of such war crimes in general, including the cruel treatment of civil population and tortures, was growing significantly. So for the time being, we may state that the occupied territories of Kharkiv and Kherson regions, they were more exposed to such type of crimes. I mean that there were bigger number of such crimes committed in those territories rather than in, for example, Chernihiv or Kyiv region, which were under occupation for shorter period, and the same story with Mykolaiv region, which was deoccupied within short period. So there is correlation, but we can only assume what is going on in the temporarily occupied territories of Zaporizhia, Donetsk or Luhansk region. We try collecting evidences about the crimes being committed there. There is a lot of such crimes which are being committed at this moment, but we cannot imagine the real picture.
You mentioned that there was evidence of command authorizing torture, or at least systemic. Do we have, I know we can't really reveal intelligence sources, but do we have any documentation that shows how high up the orders may have come from, how far, like all the way up to the general services, etc., of the Russian forces? Thank you.
насправді ми розслідуємо існування.
In fact, we investigate the role of top-level command in those tortures. Obviously, such evidences are being collected, but I cannot disclose all of them in this crowd. The case is that in Ukraine, there is no, in legislation of Ukraine, there is no such thing as a chain of command responsibility. We can only prove their participation through interrogation of their subordinates. We have, for example, colonel rank, military brought to liability for cruel treatment of Ukrainians, and top-level military. Well, we have witnesses who recognize them. They provide evidences, and we continue our work in that area. And then, based on these pieces of information and the pieces of intelligence that should be certified within the criminal investigation, we will try to prove the existence of relevant policy in military and top-level governance of Russian Federation. So we have such a suspicion, but there is no such proof so far. Thank you. Steve, please.
I'm in Pacific Rex. How does DNA collection, data collection and analysis figure into your work? And if it does, where do you get the resources? Do you work with the Ministry of Internal Affairs on that?
Власне,
Well, there are certain nuances with collecting DNA materials and information and genome information of the humans. It's actually not only in the context of war crimes, but also in investigation of criminal cases, of murders of Ukrainian military, the combatants. So there are certain nuances. The main storage of this information is the R&D Center of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Such examination is also being done by the bodies of Ministry of Justice and probably some units of the Ministry of Health. I don't know if there is any joint database, but the work is underway in this area. The most extensive database belongs to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. There is no problem with that. We actively use those examinations in our work. There is work in progress to engage the Committee for Missing in Action. I mean the International Committee for the Citizens Missing in Action. I cannot tell you in which phase is the cooperation between the committee and the Office of Prosecutors General, but during the international meetings the resolution was taken that everybody within the framework of their institutions decides how to engage those specialists to their work. But yes, this is one of the ways to obtain the evidences.
In your work, are you getting the assistance on tools like DNA mobile laboratories? In your work, are you getting the international assistance that helps you do your job?
Ми використовуємо ресурси, які надають.
We use the resources that are being provided by both competent authorities from abroad and some other international organizations, but those resources should be used within the framework of Ukrainian criminal investigations. If those are some research laboratories coming from Netherlands or France, we use every single opportunity provided to us by our partners, but it all happens within the framework of our investigation. They cannot do anything by themselves. We just engage them in our investigation actions. Thank you. We have more questions. Victoria Shevchenko, Ukrinform. My question is whether the methods of torture are different for military and Ukrainian military or civilians, or the same methods apply to all categories. Thank you. Well, based on what I've seen, the difference depends on the location. If we talk about the Ukrainian prisoners of war, the most cruel treatment they suffer in the Russian Federation. They have their methods used there, and in Ukraine, in temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine, if the prisoners of war are being kept together with the civil hostages, they are being applied the same methods of torture. So there are no specific trends, but the cruelty is omnipresent. And I cannot give you the examples really, but the treatment is equally cruel to all of the protected categories of Ukrainian citizens. In short, if I may add, it's a very complicated and sensitive topic, but for your understanding, the tortures are being used during interrogations, during detention, during arrests, and any confirmation of any claims to the persons only deteriorates the situation. The people report beating, different types of threatening as an element of interrogation in those torture chambers. People are being electrified, which is very traumatic for all of the people, and we documented very extensive number of different forms of torture, which is only limited by fantasy and some practical restrictions at certain places. But you understand it's a very delicate topic and I cannot expose all of the details. Well, and if I may add, such situation it's going on since the beginning, since 2014. They were happening in LPR and DPR, and they're spreading across Ukraine. Well, there was already a matter of Rome Statute brought up that Ukraine has not ratified it yet. I think Ms. Expert knows why it was not ratified, but to what extent does it obstacle the investigation of the war crimes, and in what way the Russian military will be brought to liability? Will it be a part of international tribunal or international criminal court, or will it be happening within the framework of national legislation? Well, non-ratification of the Rome Statute does not influence our national jurisdiction. The methods of investigation, the identification of people as the war criminals, they do not depend on either ratification or non-ratification of the Rome Statute. It would just help us to make the crime inadvertent, because the broader authority of the International Criminal Court of Ukraine in case of ratification of the Rome Statute would allow to investigate those cases by the International Criminal Court. So it would be positive phenomena to have it ratified, but in fact it doesn't influence a lot the work of investigation agencies. Well, as to the matter of bringing of those guilty to liability, all the law enforcement agencies are oriented to have every single person brought to liability. 90 or 95% of all the work is aimed at identification of those persons, and their liability is on national law enforcement system. We understand all the responsibility vested in us, and we are ready to fulfill it. Besides, we understand that the international jurisdiction will cover quite a small number of crimes or categories of crimes, and a small number of people who were involved in such crimes. But on our part, we will provide all the necessary support to international jurisdictions in those cases. I mean, International Criminal Court, and those which are about to create it shortly, hybrid or special tribunals for aggression or aggression and war crimes. We don't know it just yet, but we will provide all the necessary evidences to them in all the parts where they will require it. They have their own procedures, and the evidences that they are about to use in their processes, they collect them themselves. We just tip them, we just assist them to some limited extent, but we do everything possible to assist in the investigation of all their war crimes. Another question, microphone please. I would also like to add that International Criminal Court currently efficiently establishes connection with the public sector in Ukraine, with the civil society, including media and human rights organizations, and individual applications can be submitted to them along with the organizations. International Criminal Court has also a fund established where the victims, from which the victims can receive compensation for their losses to physical or mental health. So this is an option that can be considered too. And obviously International Criminal Court provides advisory support to Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, cooperating with them. So there is connection, there is cooperation with the court. And another important thing I want to add, if I can talk to representatives of the civil society, what's important is to have all those cases submitted to international jurisdictions to be dubbed with the national law enforcement system. Everybody recognizes that we can work efficiently. However, society doesn't trust us. So far, we do a lot of job that International Criminal Court may not be able to cover. So for us, it's important to know about all those cases that are being submitted to International
courts. Well, you collect the evidences of the crimes. There are so the persons who were executing the crimes, but there are those who were ordering those crimes. Is it possible to get them linked to Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov, and other persons? Well, talking about the cruel treatment, there may be a lot of motives of such cruel treatment. It may be a part of state policy, a part of genocide policy, or it may be a part of military intelligence, an effect of, for example, sexual violence, an effect of murder is being analyzed for the motives, why it was committed. And the evidences are available. All the evidences are being collected for every version. Every fact is unique, and it should be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. We cannot say that every single case of torture was inspired by Putin directly. Thank you. I want to thank the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world about this important topic. I want to thank all of us speakers, all of those who work on having all the guilty ones brought to liability. And we continue working for our victory. We want to thank our armed forces for the opportunity to have events like this. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.